Good evening, and welcome again to the Bible Speaks Today, coming to you from Latonia Baptist Church TV Ministries. I usually don't say that. I usually say LBC TV. About time I got it. By the way, if you're a regular viewer, I forget to say this, but the publicity people keep getting on to me, that if you go to our website, that is the church's website, which is latoniabaptist.org, you can see not only our current worship service, or the one that we've just done, but you can see recordings of these Bible Speaks programs going back quite a way. In fact, I've said this before, and I know that the librarian's going to get mad at me, but if, for example, you have a particular program that you saw or heard about and wanted to see again, we can, with a little bit of effort, put that on the website for you on a temporary basis so that you can catch up with it. We usually don't put the programs on the website until they've actually aired on the TV, for obvious reasons. And as you know, we record 2 or 3 weeks in advance so that we can, take care of, illnesses and absences and this sort of thing, because everyone who works here is a volunteer. Volunteer, and everyone uses that term, volunteer, From my mind, and I'm digressing completely from what we do, but from my mind, a professional is somebody who does something they love to do, at least most of them, and gets paid for it. If you're a professional footballer, or professional actor, or professional golfer, you're doing something that you absolutely enjoy doing, and you get paid for it. An amateur or a volunteer is doing something that they enjoy doing for the love of it, or in our case, for the love of it and for the love of God. Because the bottom line of all of this is not to make me a household word, which would probably be a bad one if it was, and not to make the names of all the teams who work here stand out in your mind. It is to get you, or to encourage you, to guide you, to read your Bible and get to know the Lord in a better way. That's really what we do it for. So volunteers, from my point of view, are as adept, as talented, as dedicated, in fact more dedicated, because we don't get paid to be here. We come because we love to. So when somebody says volunteering, don't think it's just, we couldn't get anybody else, so we want to volunteer. That's not the way to go about it. Okay, we finished up last week, and I know I went through it quite quickly, but I'd done a bit of it the week before, and I listened to the playback earlier on this evening before we were recording, and I thought, I rushed through that a bit. So I went back over some of it. But again, the part we were going over back then, right up until Rome and Jerusalem, is a part that if you've read your Old Testament, and if you haven't, you should, it's fairly well known. I mean, I know Kings is kind of repetitive and sometimes a little boring because it's, who followed who and who followed who and who did right and who did what and that sort of thing. But what I tried to do was pick up the main events that happened, as far as outside influences, because we're looking at Jerusalem now as outside influences, what's happening to Jerusalem from the outside. Okay, so we've reached now Rome and Jerusalem. Okay, in other words, as I say, Herod captured Jerusalem and knocked out the Hashmonean kingdom, okay? And then the Romans basically, let me go back a bit. Talking about how the Jerusalem was told by all the writers and Tacitus and the Talmud comments on it and this sort of thing about how it's a wonderful temple with great and all the buildings and everything. One thing I failed to mention last week, and I'll mention it now, first of all, the temple possessed enormous riches, all the gold and silver and all that. I mean, it was a wealthy place to be. But Herod also built Caesarea Maritima. Now, Caesarea is on the coast. See, Herod took a small fishing port and made it into the main port of Israel. I wish we're gradually getting to the blue screen era here, and I wish I could show you a picture of it, but go on the internet and type up Caesarea Maritima and you'll get somewhere in all those references, there'll probably be a picture of Caesarea in its heyday. It was a huge port, beautifully done. The remains of the breakwaters and that are still there today. What happened, it was such a good place because it's on the shore, ships coming in, commerce and all that, that it replaced Jerusalem as the capital of the Roman province. Okay? Now you wonder why Paul, when he was being imprisoned and went before the governor, went down to Caesarea, because that was the governor's seat at the time. And in fact, during the time of Christ's crucifixion, Pilate was only in Jerusalem for the feast. That wasn't where he normally would be, and he was staying in the garrison place, which was where the soldiers lived. His palace, his home, was down in Caesarea. Anyway, let's say this. Herod died in 4 BC, okay? In 6 AD, Judah, and by that time there'd been a lot of, political argy-bargying, Judah and the city of Jerusalem in particular came under direct Roman rule through Roman prefects, procurators and legates. That's kind of the different. The prefect was a top guy, the procurator was the local manager, and the legate did all the work. We have that today, don't we? Herod's descendants, okay, Agrippa the first from 41 to 44, Agrippa the second, now we're AD now, okay, 48 to 100, but they remained the nominal kings of the Judea province, as it was known. So they were the king, but you had a Roman governor, which would explain why the high priest went to the Roman governor to get a decision, because he, after all, was the top guy in the land, and Pilate, not wanting to give a decision, threw them off to Herod, who sent them right back again, of course. Okay, but in 66 AD, the Jews had enough. Okay, so once again, where we heard this before, they rebelled against the Roman Empire in what everyone calls today the Great Revolt. The Great Revolt. Okay, the big one, as opposed to all the little ones that they had before, I suppose. Anyway, eventually Roman legions, many of them, not just one, under Titus, under Vespasian as he was then, reconquered and subsequently destroyed much of Jerusalem and the Second Temple, or the Third Temple, whichever way you want to. Second Temple plus. Let me do it that way, all right? Okay, and then Vespasian eventually became emperor. But that in 70, it took them, 4 years eventually, marching up through to get to Jerusalem and sack it. And of course, we've got that wonderful story about Masada. There's a good film about that, by the way. You want to dig it up? It's on YouTube, I think. I think it's I'm not sure if it's an Israeli-made film, but certainly it leans towards that way, about Masada and how it. Some well-known actors in it. Anyway, it's good. So the Second Temple plus was destroyed and burnt. Okay, so all the magnificent and all that remained was this great external retaining wall, which supported the esplanade above it, next layer up, on which the temple stood. Okay, which today we know as the Great Western Wall. If you've seen any pictures of Jerusalem or Jews in Jerusalem, that huge wall that they pray at, that's the bottom part. Above that was an esplanade, and above that was the temple. So it's a pretty massive thing, okay? The victory, I said we can't always figure out quite what went on. If you want to know how the Jews were defeated, there is his victory. I'll call him Titus because that's who we know him in history as. Titus's victory is commemorated in Rome by a huge arch, which is still there today, which has got all these carvings on of the war against the Jews, and it shows all the menorahs and the temple treasures and everything being carried off in triumph. There's actually a very good fiction book about how some of the treasures are hidden in the arch. I forget what it's called, but I remember when I was reading it, I thought, oh, I know what that is. Anyway, okay, so Agrippa II died in 94. Okay, we're assuming AD now, so I won't bother to add it, which brought the Herodian dynasty, okay, to an end after about 30 years after the temple was destroyed. Now, Jerusalem became the birthplace of early Christianity, not in 30, not in 33, not in 40, 50, 60, 90 when John's Gospel was written, but in the first century. Christianity wasn't really beginning to... It was there, but it really started to become big in the first century, according to the New Testament. Because it is the location of the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension, okay? The three, the three tenets of our faith, basically. It's in Jerusalem, of course, according to the Acts of the Apostles in the Bible, that they received the Holy Spirit at Pentecost and first began preaching the gospel and proclaiming the resurrection in Jerusalem. Okay? Jerusalem eventually it becomes the home to one of the 5 patriarchates, in other words, the 5 divisions of the Christian church. And after the Great Schism, when the church split, it became part of the Eastern Orthodox Church, not the Western Christian Church. Antioch became the thing. So we got to remember here that at this point in time, it went and became part of what we call the Greek Orthodox Church today, but the Eastern Orthodox Church. Now, at the end of the revolt, the end of the revolt, temples laden, people are still there. And the Jews continue to live in Jerusalem in significant numbers. Obviously, so the Romans burnt the temple down. I still got to have a place to live. People still have to eat, still have to trade, still have to farm, and that sort of thing. And they were allowed to stay in Jerusalem, but they had to pay a tax. And that's important to remember that because if you have read the Quran and done some studying on the Quran, one of the things Muhammad, who is much later than this, one of the things Muhammad took, if you like, from what he calls the people of the book, one of the things he took from that was the thing, okay, we've conquered your land, we'd like you to convert to Islam, you don't want to, okay, then you have to pay the tax for the privilege of retaining your own religion. Now, it didn't always happen that way. Sometimes the people were hard-headed and didn't want to pay the tax and they got slaughtered. But in general, when Islam first started spreading out, it said convert to Islam or pay the tax. Okay, now, what is... Oh dear, I keep running ahead of myself, and here we go. What is today known as the Old City? Again, I wish I had a picture for you. The Old City of Jerusalem was laid out not by Jewish people, not by Christians, it was laid out by the Roman Emperor Hadrian in the 2nd century, when he began to build Jerusalem as a pagan city. Now, we all think of Jerusalem today, birth of Christ, all the way through. Pity they're fighting about it today, but it's a Christian city, not a bit of it. Jerusalem was a pagan city. In 130, Hadrian visited the ruins of Jerusalem. Now get this, which were remaining after the First Roman-Jewish War of 66, 73. Okay? So it's been what? 60 years? 60 years later, Jerusalem's still much of a ruin. Okay? He rebuilt the city, Emperor Hadrian, renamed it Aelia Capitolonia in 135, and then he put the main city's forum. The Romans always had a Roman forum in a city. He built one. He built a large temple to Jupiter in the city, which today, believe it or not, it became the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Okay? But it was originally a temple to Jupiter. He did replace he did place a lot of restrictions on some Jewish practices. It's not clear what they were. Whether it was, ritual sacrifice, which was sort of I don't know the Romans would object to that because they did that anyway themselves. But anyway, something the Jews were doing, I don't know, whatever it was, he put restrictions on them. So a chap called Simon Bar Kokhba revolted. Seems to be the way things are, doesn't it? Okay. Hadrian, having learnt from his experiences of the previous emperor and the one before that, responded with overwhelming force. I mean, he didn't just send, he literally put down the rebellion. It says in the history books that he killed as many as 500,000 Jews. Well, sometimes in history books you have to be careful of the numbers, as you do in the Bible, because people tend to elevate the numbers. I mean, you've only got today to read a newspaper report that says several hundred people were protesting outside P&G, and then in the evening news you see a picture of the crowd, and if there's 100 of them, it's so they get embellished. But anyway, certainly a great many Jews were killed, and he resettled the city as a Roman colony. Now remember from past programs, a Roman colony was where it was a Roman city, and they took retired soldiers when they retired out of the army and then didn't have any home anymore because they'd been in the army 30 years or whatever. They stuffed them there. A lot of the towns that Paul visited were Roman colony towns, okay, that literally were set up as suburban dwelling places for retired military and civil service people. So it was a Roman town, okay? And the Jews, believe it or not, the Jews, this is about 130, 140, the Jews were forbidden to enter the city but for a single day of the year on the 9th of Av, which is the fast day where the Jews commemorate the destruction of the temples. They were allowed to come into the city for that day. Okay? So, no Jews in Jerusalem, only once a day. They may have been living around Jerusalem, but not in a town. It was a Roman town, walled city. And for the next 150 years, would you believe that Jerusalem remained a relatively unimportant pagan Roman town? Now, I'm quite sure most of us didn't know that. We've assumed it's been a big centre of worship. It wasn't. Hadn't got a temple, hadn't got anything. People would go to the synagogues. And you can see why the Western Christian church expanded out of all recognition, because there wasn't this big tie back to Israel. So if we go on then in what they call the early Byzantine Empire period, the Emperor Constantine suddenly converted to Christianity. If you remember that, some of the Holy Roman Emperor became a Christian, and so that meant I'm a Christian, everybody's a Christian, all right? Or at least I get to make the rules. And so what he did was he rebuilt the city as a Christian center of worship. So it goes back, right? It goes back into being a center of religious importance, okay? He built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 325. So in the year 300, it changes, okay? He builds the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on top of the temple to Jupiter. I guess he knocks it down or converts it or whatever he does. You can't. There's not that much stone around. You've got to use what you can. And Jerusalem got special recognition in the Nicene meeting. If you read your history, they had this big meeting. Constantine called all the people together and wanted to know, first of all, how the Bible, what was the books of the Bible. Remember that? That's where the Nicene meeting decided that they would have what's the word I'm looking for? Some standardization, which is where we got that. Okay, So the First Council of Nicaea in 325, they did that, and also it got special recognition. One of the canons in there, the articles in that Nicaea meeting, calls out Jerusalem as the centre of the faith and that sort of thing. Do you remember? You've probably heard of Helena, the mother of Constantine's mother, who was also converted. She made a pilgrimage to the city, again, great novel about it and a film about it too, I think, and claimed to have recovered the true cross, of which several thousand pieces exist all over the world, which if you put them all together would make about 4 or 5 crosses, I'm quite sure. But anyway, she believed, bless her heart, that she discovered the true cross. And of course the pictures all show this marvellously square-cut crucifix, whereas we know it was probably a crossbar on a Y piece, that sort of thing. Anyway, regardless of that, his mother did a lot to promote Jerusalem as being the place to go. Okay? But Jews were still barred from the city, and I guess because of the Christian influence, but the Jews were barred from the city through the remainder of its time as a Roman province. Constantine's a Roman emperor, right? So all through that time, the Jews were still barred. It's now a Christian city, totally gone over. Okay. Now we move on to the Caliphate's period. Okay. Now, the Quran doesn't mention the name Jerusalem. It does not. But the faithful believe that it was from Jerusalem that Muhammad ascended to heaven. So the reason was that the city was one of the Arab Caliphate's first conquests in 638. That's when there's a wonderful book called The Great Arab Conquest, which sort of traces the history of Islam, how it started in Medina, moved to Mecca, and then spread over the whole of the Middle East. And according to Arab historians, it was one of the first big cities that they won, okay, in 638. Okay, and Umar ibn al-Khattab, who was a very famous figure in the Quran and Arab history, went to the city to receive its surrender, right? Cleaned it out and prayed at the Temple Mount in the process. Temple Mount, top of the temple, right? Temple's gone, Temple Mount. What he did 60 years later, what they did was they built the Dome of the Rock. If you've seen Jerusalem, pictures of Jerusalem, you've seen the Dome of the Rock, which was a structure enshrining a stone from which Muhammad is said to have ascended into heaven. So big thing for Islam. The octagonal gold-sheeted dome that you see in the pictures is not the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is somewhat to the south. And the latest version of that was built some 300 years later, so we're not really get there yet. But Umar ibn allowed the Jews back into the city, giving them freedom to live and worship in the city after, have you worked it out yet? 400 years. So for 400 years there was no Jewish influence in the city at all. And under the early centuries of Muslim rule, and it is centuries, okay, especially since Umayyad, who's 650 to 750, and Abbasid, who's 750 to 969, okay, it really prospered. There's some Arab geographers, Ibn Harkal and another gentleman, who described it as the most fertile province of Palestine. In 946, a gentleman who'd been born in Jerusalem devoted many pages of a famous work he did, which is called, I never heard of it before, The Best Divisions in the Knowledge of Climates and Things, made a big, huge song and dance about how Jerusalem was so fertile and popular. And if you know Jerusalem today, it's the middle of a desert almost. So you see how things change over the centuries. Okay? Under Muslim rule, however, Jerusalem didn't get that political or cultural status that it had had before, and it didn't come up to the same standard as the other Muslim capitals, Damascus, Baghdad, and Cairo. It's just kind of interesting. Well, the early Arab period was kind of interesting, and we're running out of time here. But the early Arab period, it's kind of almost waiting for the other shoe to drop, because what happened was Jews were allowed to live there, this sort of thing. Everybody, carried on as normal. There wasn't Muslims and Jews lived side by side. Okay, so you've got a kind of interesting. What's the word I'm trying to find? An interesting parallel. People saying how Arabs and Jews can't live side by side. Well, they did for 200 or 300 years. Before what happened. Well, as I say, very much religious trances. However, we're running out of time. But in the early part of the 11th century, okay, and the Egyptian, the Fatimid Caliphate had taken over the rulings from Egypt, and for some reason out of in 1033 or just before 1033, he ordered the destruction in Jerusalem of all the churches. Can't think why, no given reason. And then in 1033 itself, there was an earthquake which damaged the mosque, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then, of course, the next caliphate comes along between 1034 and 1036 and completely rebuilds it and renovates it. Makes it smaller, of course. So, it was a pretty massive place with a huge, made of wood dome on it. So, with that now the next thing happens is the Crusaders, and we're going to save that for next week, all right? I ran out of time. So just bear with me, and next week we'll talk about the Crusader period. Till then, keep your Bible handy. Good night.